So you'll see the title of the presentation this morning is Managing Conflicts of Interest. That's a little bit of a misnomer, because what we're going to go over is all of the tools that are going to assist you and your licensees in managing the conflicts that are contemplated by the superintendent's new rules and the forms. So let's go to it. All right, so the overview of our presentation today, we're going to be going into exploration of the new microsite that has been developed to assist licensees, and in particular managing brokers, in managing all the new knowledge that's going to need to be applied. We'll go over the forms and the guides and the managing broker toolkit, which has been specifically designed for you to help you in the supervision and training of your licensees. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions, but I suspect we will not have time for all of the questions. So I'll again refer you to the knowledge base microsite. So the knowledge base, I would think most of you have had an opportunity to explore the site somewhat. This microsite is targeted specifically to managing brokers and licensees as a resource to navigate the new superintendent's rules and the required changes to business practices to ensure compliance. So the latest resource is actually, this screen is from before Friday. As of Friday, we updated with more resources. And I was just thinking, if you've got a second screen or device, in addition to that which you're watching this presentation on, you might want to bring the microsite up, bring up the knowledge base, and you'll be able to explore it thoroughly as we go through this. One of the things that I'm really enjoying about the new site is the how nimble the search function is. It's a great improvement as to the search function that we had on our existing site. So the knowledge, if you just type in knowledge.recbc.ca, that'll take you to the website. Or if you just go to the council site, recbc.ca, there's a banner that you land on, and if you click on that, it'll take you to the site as well. So the knowledge base was launched on May 15, and it includes a lot of it. There's just a ton of information on agency and disclosure rules, including new disclosure forms and guides, a library of articles, FAQs, videos, and audio content. It's mobile compatible and easy to browse, powerful search capacity. And I'd like just to acknowledge the remarkable work that our communications department has done in a very short period of time, being able to bring up all of this information for licensees. Now, this next screen is a little bit of a disappointment to us. This is our digital communication e-news open rates. It's a bit of an anomaly. We've heard complaints that we are not providing enough information, and it's well understood everyone's super busy and there's lots of incoming traffic, but having an average weekly open rate of our e-news is a bit disappointing, 26%. So it would be really great if you could get your licensees to accept that they have a professional obligation to understand the application of the rules and the changes and how the changes are going to impact their day-to-day business. So it's really important that they immerse themselves in this. And as I said, I know everyone's busy, but this is a professional obligation that must be taken seriously. Now, we've been doing videos, and there's a new suite of videos that is coming out in addition to the existing videos that we have available on the site. Other council staff, auditors, the director of accounting and audit, and legal have participated in developing more videos, and they'll be coming out shortly. The video that I've done, Unrepresented Parties, I've suggested that actually that could be a discipline penalty, that somebody has to watch the whole thing if in the event that they've misconducted themselves. So I'm the first to admit all of this content is dry, but it's essential that licensees get a very firm professional grasp on all of the information. So let's go on to the new forms. On the knowledge base, all of the forms are available. All of the new forms are available. And you'll see on the top bar that there's different, as people learn in different ways, licensees can choose to read articles, listen to audio. We've done some podcasts, browse the FAQs, look at the actual forms, read the Real Advice newsletters, and watch the videos. So let's continue with our exploration of the knowledge base. So guides to the forms. In addition to the forms, which are very self-explanatory, there's information pages before the actual forms. And the information pages are going to be available in multiple languages. The forms themselves will be in English, but the information pages will be in multiple languages. So in addition to that information, there's actually guides that have been developed to assist licensees in the conversations that they're going to have with consumers around the forms. So the first form, disclosure of representation in trading services. This is a new form, but the obligation of disclosure of agency representation has not changed. Under 510, licensees have always had the obligation before providing trading services to disclose the nature of their representation to the consumer. The new form is evidence of the licensee having complied with that requirement. So there was a change in the rules that now makes this disclosure have to be in writing. So it is not a new obligation. The only new obligation is to use the form to disclose the nature of the representation in trading services. And as you're aware, the superintendent in the rule made a carve out that the disclosure form does not have to be presented if the licensee is only hosting an open house or just providing general factual information. So the form describes very much what the options are as a real estate consumer. And you may be aware that we have an application that can be used on a mobile device for the disclosure of representation in trading services form, and additionally for the disclosure of risk to unrepresented parties. So the disclosure of risk to unrepresented party, this form is used when you're already representing a party and then you're dealing with an unrepresented party. So it's a 1-2, the 510 disclosure of representation. And then if you are representing a party already to that trade or prospective trade, you would need to use the disclosure of risk to unrepresented parties form. So 1-2. This form is new and the rule is new. And as it says on the slide, needs to be presented immediately after 510 if you are representing, for example, a seller. Now, the disclosure to sellers of expected remuneration, this form and the rule is new. This is used by a listing agent, a seller's agent, when presenting offers to the sellers. So it's specifically for seller clients. A buyer has nothing to do with this form. A buyer's agent has nothing to do with this form. It is the seller's agent, the listing agent, that presents this form to the seller. It must be in a dollar amount. Separate disclosure for each offer or counter offer. And this is in addition to the disclosure that is made on a service agreement, for example, under Section 5-1 of the rules. So it's to increase transparency so that the seller knows exactly what the remuneration, the dollar amount that the listing brokerage is earning, the amount that is being shared with a cooperating brokerage, and any referrals that the licensee may be receiving. One of the facts that needs to be considered with this form is the definition of cooperating brokerage in the new rules captures if, for example, another designated agent from the listing brokerage brought an offer. So that designated agent from the listing brokerage, they would be considered the cooperating brokerage. So that's something to keep in mind. So the gross amount that the listing brokerage is getting, the amount that is being shared with the cooperating brokerage, the final amount that the listing brokerage is getting, and any other remuneration, such as a referral. And on the referral, keep in mind that any referral that a licensee was anticipating receiving would have already been disclosed under Section 511 of the council rules. This, like redisclosing the commission amount, is confirming the amount of referral that the licensee anticipates receiving. So disclosure of risks associated with dual agency. This is something that you've been thinking about since, was it October of 2017, when the first proposed rules of the superintendent came out. So this is something that I know that you've been putting your minds to. So the new form, new rule, it's got to be filled out by the managing broker before presenting the form to the consumer. That declaration by the managing broker must be promptly sent to the council. A separate form would be needed for each consumer, so they each were received the declaration of the managing broker as to why the trade involved a remote, underserved location where it was impracticable for anything other than dual agency. The form itself is not a dual agency agreement, so the parties would still have to enter into a dual agency agreement after this form had been presented to the consumers. So the most recent form, which just came out last week, had to do with the newest of the superintendent's rules, and that's 5-18, agreement regarding conflicts of interest between clients. This form is to be used where you have two existing clients that have competing interests. And what the form, what the licensee does with this form is explain to their clients that there is a conflict, there are competing interests, and they must seek the agreement of both parties to either release one client and continuing representing the other client, or if the parties don't agree to that, then the licensee must cease acting for either client. They must cease providing trading services to either client. Now, something that I will touch on at this point, and it is a matter that we are attempting to address, and that is the question of trading services in relation to rental property. So the first two forms, the disclosure of representation and disclosure to unrepresented parties, need to be presented in trading services in relation to rental. The agreement regarding conflicts of interest, although in many instances, in fact, in most instances, it's understood that tenants aren't represented. In the event that there was a tenant being represented by the same licensee that was representing, for example, a landlord, this form could be used. The disclosure of remuneration at the time of presenting offers applies only to trading services. Sellers, it applies only to sellers, not to assignors or landlords. So these forms are mandatory and can't be altered or edited. That being said, there is nothing that precludes a licensee from making notes on the forms that would give further evidence. For example, if an unrepresented party declined to sign a disclosure representation or disclosure to unrepresented parties. We're asked why the signature of consumers is not mandatory, and it's not mandatory because the council does not have the authority to compel consumers to sign the forms. So keep that in mind. So the forms are mandatory, cannot be altered or edited. Now, we've developed a managing broker toolkit that we're hoping will be of great use to you as managing brokers. And it's you've got a big task. You've always got a big task as a managing broker, your obligations of supervision and ensuring that your licensees are well educated. So when you explore the toolkit, you'll see the resources to support you, to assist you to train and supervise licensees, manage the brokers, brokerage overall, and in its administration. So let's reflect on why all of this has come about. And it has to do with consumer protection. And so this slide is a reminder, the importance of informed consent and proper disclosures. So the forms need to be treated as tools, not just pieces of paper to push in front of a consumer. It's a consumer protection tool to ensure you have a fully informed consumer, which is then a protected consumer. And we all know a mere signature on a prescribed form doesn't necessarily indicate informed consent. So this is a mantra of mine. Licensees have to make sure that they don't allow their clients to abdicate their responsibilities as the principal. The licensee advises, but ultimately it is the client that decides. So the licensee, as a trusted advisor with special expertise, has to be able to express to their clients why this information is important. So as always, licensees should take a thorough and consultative approach. Now, retention of records, the brokerages will need to keep records of the new disclosures as required by the existing rules. And disclosures under 510, 510.1, 511, and now 518 are required to be kept as prescribed in the rules 8-4 and 8-5. Disclosures, the limited dual agency statement from the managing broker must be sent promptly to counsel, and of course the brokerage would want to keep a copy of that. And licensees of all these forms must provide copies to their licensee, to their brokerages, and that's under section 3-2. I just want to refer to some information that our audit department will be considering. So when we look at your record management system, records of the brokerage must be maintained in accordance with the legislation. You need to familiarize yourself with section 8-9.1 and 8.10 of the rules and section 25. That talks about the maintenance of records and the accessibility of records. And electronic records, copies must be kept in BC. Copies must be easily transferable to a printed format for inspection by the council. Now, here is the what I was referring to, what our auditors will be looking for. And this applies to all the forms except the disclosure of risk with associated with dual agency, because we'll already have those. How is the brokerage storing the forms? How individual forms may be retrieved upon request by the council, the brokerage's retention and destruction policies relating to the forms, and the training the brokerage provides to its licensees with respect to the proper use of forms. And I know many of you have been doing extensive training in-house, so I applaud you for that. And in addition to that, I know that brokerages are looking at their policy and procedure manuals, because that is what the auditors will be wanting to look at. What policies and procedures do you have in place to ensure compliance? How is that communicated to your licensees? And how regularly are records being examined for compliance? So here we are with respect to the risks associated with dual agency. The council will flag each of the forms submitted by a managing broker that explains why dual agency is being practiced. And it'll track the licensee, the managing broker, and the brokerages. So there are certainly instances where it's going to be appropriate, but in most circumstances, dual agency will not be practiced. This will allow the council to run reports on who's using the disclosure of risks associated with dual agency and the frequency of the forms use. The forms, when they come to the council, will be examined by the manager of compliance. He's going to be reviewing all of the forms and ensuring compliance. And again, this is new territory, so we have to measure things. How often are they being used, and when are they being used? So that wraps me up for this morning. So we've got quite a bit of time for questions, and I hope I can be of assistance.
Okay, Maureen, the questions have been coming in steadily as you've been talking. So I'm going to start running through some of them, and for any licensees, any managing brokers out there who don't hear their question asked, You know, we are trying to go through them in order, and we'll get as far as we can. The first question is actually one that you've already addressed, but I think it's worth repeating because it's a question we are hearing quite frequently. And that again is, why are the consumer portions of the forms optional?
Again, we just do not have the authority under the legislation to compel consumers to sign anything. For example, a service agreement. Sorry, I'm stuttering here. A service agreement that's required under Section 5(1) of the rules, for example, a consumer can waive that requirement. And it's the same with the forms. A licensee is compelled themselves to complete the form and sign the form, but we cannot compel a consumer to. It would be disingenuous of us on a council form to suggest that it is mandatory.
So another question that we're seeing here is, when remuneration changes in a negotiation, can it be changed and initialed on the disclosure of remuneration form, or is an entirely new form required?
I think you need to put your mind to it, just like any form that you use, whether it be a contract of purchase or sale or any other disclosure form. If it gets confusing, and if you handed it to a third party and they couldn't tell what happened, you create uncertainty. So the rule doesn't say that in every instance you must use a new form, but I would suggest that that's best business practices, because then you would have a record of each time that there is an offer made or a counter offer.
Maureen, here's another question that I think you actually covered, but again, I think just for clarity, it's worth emphasizing it. The question is, does a buyer's agent have a duty to disclose the remuneration to the buyer? And if so, do we need to use the new disclosure of remuneration forms?
A buyer's agent has always had an obligation to disclose their remuneration to their buyer client if they're receiving that remuneration from another party, such as the seller. So of course you have to disclose it, and it has always been that under Section 511. The new form, and I'll repeat it, it is presented by sellers' agents to sellers when presenting offers or counter offers to the seller. The buyer has no role in it. The buyer's agent has no role in it. The obligation to disclose remuneration under 511 is unchanged. This new disclosure, 511.1, is, as I said, a licensee who is representing the seller making the disclosure to the seller with every offer and counter offer. While I'm on that, by the way, the rule does not require that disclosure be made when the seller is countering back. However, I believe that a prudent licensee would do that, especially with the dollar amounts we're dealing with in many parts of the province. Say, for example, you had an offer at 1.2 and the seller countered back at 1.8. That would be a significant change in the remuneration. And so put your minds to, and brokerages may want to develop policy around that. So it's not, the rule does not particularize that the seller's counter offer back to a buyer, that the licensee makes a disclosure, but I would suggest that would be a prudent business practice.
Great. Okay, another question about the disclosure of remuneration form. Do licensees need to provide a copy of that form to their brokerage every time a disclosure of remuneration is made?
Yes.
Or do they do it all at once at the end of a negotiation?
Oh, of course you would. I mean, you would be retaining those records and promptly delivering them to your brokerage, but every form must be delivered to the brokerage at the end of the negotiation. It promptly means at the earliest opportunity. So it wouldn't be mid-negotiation. It would be when the negotiations are concluded, the next morning, for example. Or if you're doing it, taking pictures and sending it electronically, that would also suffice.
Great. Okay. And another question on that topic, it's one of real interest today. Does a licensee need to disclose their commission splits with their brokerage?
No.
Okay, that was an easy one. Here's another one. Many offers from a buyer's agent are verbal. Does the listing agent who verbally presents them to their seller need to use the form still?
It would be reckless to present an offer verbally or communicate an offer verbally. So this is when you are presenting an offer or a counteroffer. A verbal offer in real estate is not it's a threatened offer. It's not an offer. So it concerns me that licensees are communicating verbally on something as impactful as a contract, a purchase and sale, or a lease. Or pardon me, not the lease. Back that one out. Thank you.
Well, on the topic of leases, here's a question. In a commercial lease, if our realtor acts for the tenant and the landlord is represented by a rental property management company, would the landlord be considered an unrepresented party?
No.
Okay. Another question about the disclosure to sellers of expected remuneration. When we help assignors sell their assignments, do we need to complete that form?
No, the rule is very prescriptive. It says sellers. So it's not lease landlords or lessors or assignors. It is sellers. The rule is very clear on that.
Okay. Switching now to a question about Rule 5-18. There's a managing broker who is wondering, when would a property manager be in a situation where that would apply?
Again, it would be if they were representing both the landlord and the tenant.
Right. Here's a question again about that 518 form. Can you go from a client relationship to an unrepresented party relationship?
The rule anticipates that if the parties agree, you can release one client and retain the other. The ability to deal with the released client as an unrepresented party is fraught with risk. So if you go to the FAQs on our website, it speaks to this. What the issue would be, the risk for the consumer is that they still would be viewing the licensee as though they were their agent, when in fact they've been released. The risk for the licensee is, after having dealt with this individual as a client, wandering into implied agency by being assistive, by being helpful. So it would be, it's an area that would be of high risk. And I think that brokerages, again, may want to develop policy on this. You can just imagine if we received a complaint from the unrepresented party that said they still were you were still acting as though you were their agent, and then from the other side, from the continuing client who suspects that you shared confidential information. It's just a very, very difficult position, and one to be avoided.
Great. Well, here's a question about the effective date of the new rules, which, as we know, is June 15th. The question is, if we're already working with a client before June 15th, what are the obligations with regards to making these disclosures?
If you've complied appropriately up to June 15th, then there's no change. After June 15th, any new clients or consumers, that's where they come into effect. If you've already made appropriate agency disclosure of representation to your clients, there is no change. On June 15th, you will be required to use the new forms. I'll just touch on that. People had some questions about if you were in a limited dual agency relationship prior to June 15th. Again, because prior to June 15th, that has been acceptable if properly executed. That relationship could continue after June 15th, but you would not be able to enter into any new dual agency relationships after June 15th, excepting in the very narrow circumstances of remote, underserved, and impracticable.
So Maureen, here's a question to do with a managing broker's duty to train staff, and that's whether you have suggestions about the best way to train staff in the conveyance or administration departments of a brokerage.
Actually, I think that's a great question. All of the information on the website is available to everyone, members of the public, your conveyance staff, all of it. And everyone knows that, or I've always believed that the conveyance staff is the backbone of many brokerages. And so I'd heartily encourage you to have your conveyance staff become familiar with the knowledge base. There also, I understand, will be the ability, the online course on agency and disclosures, once we get the required cohort of licensees through, would be available for anyone to sign up to take that course. So that's another area that we can't do it right now because we're trying to get as many people as possible through the course. But my understanding from education is there will be that availability in the future.
Great. Now there's a question here. Do any of the new forms, the new disclosure rules, the dual agency rule, does any of that affect strata licensees?
No.
Great. Very nice and clear. So here's a question, again, going back to the 518 agreement form. Can a 518 agreement form by a buyer be negotiated as part of a buyer's agency contract? So I think that means you do it in
no,
advance.
you can't. I mean, any service agreement could contemplate the potential conflict, but the conflict must be dealt with when it arises.
So Maureen, another question that we're seeing here, are there exemptions for licensees who are representing developers? And would any of those exemptions exist under REDMA?
No. Licensees that represent developers, all of these obligations flow as they do to any licensee representing a seller or a buyer. And with project marketing in particular, project marketing licensees that specialize in project marketing are used to dealing with complex documents and getting informed consent before going forward. So I can imagine that the project marketing people are putting their mind, the licensees are putting their mind to how they will integrate the disclosure of representation and disclosure to of risk to unrepresented parties, along with the disclosure statements, I would believe. But they are standalone forms and they are required by the council, and they must be retained and promptly delivered to the brokerage.
Another question that I know you've heard before, Maureen, but again, I think for clarity, it's worth getting it out there. Is there any exemption for people selling commercial?
No, the superintendent's rules do not contemplate any exemptions for anyone that provides trading services, whether it's trading services in relation to rental property or commercial, industrial, agricultural, residential. All of trading services are captured under the superintendent's new rules.
Great. Okay, and so going back again to rental property management, is the reference to unrepresented parties specific to commercial tenants?
I'm not sure I understand the question. A commercial tenant may be represented or not. So there's no carve out at all. In rental property management, trading services in relation to rental property management, my understanding is most residential tenants are unrepresented, and so they have to be mindful of that. But there's no difference with commercial than any other element.
So Maureen, here's a question that doesn't necessarily specifically relate to the council, but I think it's also a good one to get some clarity on, and that's when will service agreements reflect the new disclosure requirements and the ban on limited dual agency?
My understanding, now the standard forms, as most of you know, are British Columbia, or the ones that are most widely used are BCREA forms. And my understanding is that they have sent them to web forms and they anticipate having them up prior to the June 15, on or around the June 15 date. That's the latest that we've heard. So there's been a great deal of work done, and they will, our understanding is they'll be available for the implementation date.
And you know, I think on that note, it's probably also worth emphasizing that the new mandatory forms for the council will also be available on web forms by June 15th.
Yes, exactly. So the forms, as you see them on the knowledge base, will be on web forms. So it'll be part of the resources that will be available to you. So we're pleased with that.
Yeah. And Maureen, we've also had a couple of questions about the digital apps that are being developed for 2 of the forms. And there was a question as to whether you could talk a little bit more about how those will work.
I'm not quite sure what to say other than we've tested them. They seem to be working really well. The licensee will be able to send the completed form directly to the brokerage. They'll be able to email it to a consumer. The form, once after it's filled out, will be launched as a PDF that looks exactly like the paper forms. So it's a licensee can go into the app at the beginning and do their setup, so they're not doing setup every time they go in, and navigate their way through the application. The consumer has an ability to navigate their way through the application, and then the licensee confirms that everything is as corrected. You can do a signature for the licensee, and the consumer has the ability to sign on the digital form as well. It's retained for, I believe it's 72 hours, but it'll be date stamped showing the time that it was completed. So it really, I'm really impressed. Again, the work that our communications and legal department have done with this. So I think licensees will find it a very useful application.
Yeah, and so those 2 digital apps will be available for the disclosure of representation in trading services and the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties.
Exactly.
Yeah. It might also be worth mentioning that more information will be forthcoming in our Real Advice e-newsletter this week to let people know about where those forms will be available, the digital forms, and more about how to use them when they are launched.
That's a great point, Marilee, and I think that goes back to the screen that I found disappointing, the 26% open rate. The information that's being sent out weekly by council really is useful, and this, what Marilee is describing, is exactly why you and your licensees need to read what we're sending out.
So back to some of the questions that we're seeing here. There's a question about, can we use the new forms now?
The forms aren't live to be used, and it wouldn't be appropriate because the rules are not in force until June the 15th. I mean, thinking about the forms, looking through the forms, practicing your presentations on the forms, by all means, we really encourage you to become as familiar with those forms as you are with all other forms that you use daily. But because they reference specific portions of the rules that will not be implemented until June 15th, it would not be appropriate.
Here's another question again about rental property management. Tenants typically have no representation by a property manager.
That's right.
So would the tenant have to agree to be unrepresented?
Yes.
Great. Here's another question, this time about trading services. I am representing a client now. What are my obligations to disclose remuneration on offers received after June 15th?
Oh, after June 15th, on June 15th and after, any offer or counter offer that you present to a seller, if you are the seller's agent, you must use the disclosure of expected remuneration form in accordance with section 5-11.1 of the rules.
All right. And here's a question, again, one that we've heard many times, but I think is useful to underline for clarity in that. Can we expand on what impracticable, remote, and underserved mean?
We don't have a definition. The definition of an impracticable was easy because it means not possible of being done in general terms. Remote and underserved are not words that have been defined in the rules, and it's going to be subjective. And that's why sound professional judgment on the part of managing brokers and their licensees will need to be applied in assessing those three elements.
Okay, so here's another question. If I represent a seller and a past client starts to work with another agent, that buyer is no longer my client. Would I need to fill out any disclosure forms, and which ones?
There isn't a form. You would need to disclose this as material information to your existing, for example, seller client. And a prudent licensee always renders any disclosures in writing. So it could be, Bob, I sold this buyer's house 3 years ago. They're no longer my client. The only duty I owe them is a continuing duty of confidentiality about the information that I obtained 2 years ago about them. And there you have it. So this hasn't changed. You must always disclose all material information to your client, and a prudent licensee would follow up with an email or a note to file or something that would be evidence of them complying with their duties to clients.
Okay. I think that mention of a past client is perhaps it's worth talking a little more about the fact that the agreement called for under the Rule 5-18 only applies to working with current clients. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yep, that's exactly right. The 518 very specifically is dealing with when you have two existing clients with competing interests. So it's not to deal with past clients. There may be conflicts with past clients that you're going to have to deal with and disclose to, as I said before, to your current client. And in some instances, you may be conflicted out depending on how much your ability to represent your current client would be impaired. But typically dealing with past clients, if they're represented by another licensee, you're able to do that again once you've disclosed to your existing client what that former relationship was under material information.
Here's a great question. If a licensee acts as a limited dual agent after June 15th, what as a managing broker should I do?
Well, that would be under your obligations as a managing broker to take appropriate steps when you become aware of any misconduct. So you're going to have to deal with the licensee, and sometimes the appropriate step is reporting it to the real estate council. So that's a decision that managing brokers are going to have to make. Limited dual agency under 517 cannot be practiced without the participation of a managing broker. So if a licensee went ahead and acted as a dual agent, that has serious implications for the licensee and the consumer, and ultimately for the brokerage. So that is something, and I know managing brokers are very good at this, of very clearly drawing the line in the sand so their licensees understand what's acceptable and what absolutely is not acceptable.
Great. So here's a question about the working with a realtor brochure and whether after June 15th, that's something that can still be used with consumers.
My understanding is that form will not be available. The form that must be used with consumers are the forms required by council, the disclosure of representation and the disclosure of risk to unrepresented parties. The working with the realtor, the BCRA working with the realtor form is not the form that would bring the licensee into compliance.
Yeah. And again, although it's not a council issue, we are of the understanding that there is an additional privacy form being developed by BCRA to manage that aspect of what the working with a realtor brochure used to do.
Exactly.
This is kind of a general question, and Maureen, I don't know if you've got something more you'd like to say, but the question is, could you please talk some more about the dual agency form?
I'm not quite sure what to say about it. Again, the rule is very prescriptive, And the form itself is very clear. Just, I mean, I'm sure I've got it here. Understanding the risks of dual agency. So the statement that the brokerage has to provide to the council, the rule itself sets that out. And just let me get here. Now I'm happy I'm doing section speak, right? So the dual agency, let me read it. Before providing any trading services that constitute dual agency, a licensee must make a disclosure to each party in a form approved by the council that includes a statement of the brokerage signed by the managing broker, clearly setting out the reasons why subsection 1, dual agency, applies, and the following information. A, the duties and responsibilities of the licensee to the clients of the licensee in a dual agency relationship, and B, the risks associated with a dual agency relationship. And then it goes on to enter into a written agreement to dual agency with each party under section 3-3.1, modifications of duties after making the disclosure. But the disclosure and the statement of the brokerage must precede the licensee providing trading services that would constitute dual agency. So one of the things that I do over and over again, just to get my head around these rules, is I read the rules. And I'm not being facetious. Every once in a while I think, and I'll go back and I'll read the rule, and then I am able to settle down and think, okay, now I got it again. So I really strongly suggest, as in addition to all the FAQs and videos and guides, your source is the actual rules. And so I would strongly recommend that you review them regularly.
And those rules are available on the licensee knowledge base under the subject area of legislation and policy. So yeah, they're easy to find, and yeah, certainly worth reading over and over again. So Maureen, here's a question about stopping to represent clients. So and I guess this comes back to the actual title of our webinar today, Managing Conflicts. What are the circumstances under which a licensee must cease representing clients?
I'm a
conflict of interest that would,
well,
you have to step
there's
away.
so many, and I'm afraid that this is one of the wrestles that we have. There are so many scenarios, and what licensees and managing brokers have to, rather than thinking of all the scenarios, think of the overriding principles of undivided loyalty, confidentiality, conflicts of interest. Anytime these things come up, you need to make disclosure, and you always have to be thinking, who is my client? Who am I working for? So there's many instances where conflicts can arise, and they must be disclosed. Licensees have a positive obligation to avoid conflicts, and when they arise, to disclose those conflicts to their client. So there are going to be instances, and what you have to think about the overarching principles of agency and the degree to which your ability to act as an agent may be impaired. If you are not able to act as an agent, you may have to cease acting for the client and refer them out to either another licensee or for other professional, such as legal advice.
Okay, we're almost out of time, and we've still got questions coming in thick and fast. So, as I said at the beginning, we are trying to get through them as quickly as possible. If you have a question, you've asked a question, and we don't get to it, all questions can be answered by looking at the resources on the licensee knowledge base. So I do encourage, or I think Maureen, yeah. I'm speaking for Maureen. Maureen encourages everyone to use that as a resource. But here's a question about past clients, Maureen. And it's setting out a scenario. Someone you sold a house to a year ago wants to offer on your current listing as an unrepresented party. What should I do?
You should have a discussion with your client and explain that this is a past client and they want you to deal with them as an unrepresented party, and discuss with them what the risks are of you doing that. It is always prudent. The point of these rules is not so that there's opportunity to deal with unrepresented parties unfettered, pardon me. The purpose of these rules are consumer protection. So it would be prudent of the licensee, once they have the conversation with their seller and make the disclosure of representation to the buyer and disclosure of risk to unrepresented parties, as the form requires, to recommend that the unrepresented party seek independent representation. And we've talked quite a bit about licensees and their brokerages need to develop efficient, transparent referral networks so that a licensee can effectively and efficiently, after of course talking to their client, refer an unrepresented party to another licensee.
Okay, so 2 more questions, and then I think we are going to have to wrap up. And both of these questions have to do with the new agreement for managing conflicts under Section 518. So the first one is, can I show 2 buyers the same house and still represent both of them?
Yeah, we've had an opinion on that. And to show 2 buyers that are current clients would be a conflict of interest that amounts to dual agency. However, and I'm reading this from a memo written by our legal department, the council recognizes that requiring licensees to stop representing clients in these situations would be unreasonably disruptive to consumers and to licensees. After all, in many cases, a buyer client may view the property and decide that they are not interested in pursuing it. That would end the conflict immediately. However, licensees must take steps to protect the interests of their clients and to comply with the intent of the rule banning dual agency. With that in mind, the council has adopted guidelines. This information is on the knowledge base. And so what it essentially is, the licensee, if a buyer client wishes to view one of the licensee's listings, the licensee is in a conflict that has to be disclosed. And then during the showing, they can only give general information about the property and no other services. However, if the buyer wants any further trading services with respect to the property, the licensee would then have to comply with Section 5-18. I strongly encourage licensees, managing brokers to go to the resource base, and the article is called Showing But Not Telling, Managing Conflicts of Interest When Showing Properties. So again, there may be situations where you just think, no, I don't want to do that, and you're going to send your clients away. But this is a guideline that's been developed. So I strongly suggest that managing brokers circulate this to their licensees.
Okay, and our final question for the day.
Final.
Again, to do with that agreement on conflicts. If a buyer refuses to sign the agreement, can I still represent the seller?
No, the rule is very prescriptive. It says that if either party does not agree to it, you must seek providing real estate trading services to either party. So that the rule was brought in, if you recall, the superintendent was trying to deal with the double recusal, where if you had 2 clients with competing interests, you in all instances had to send them away. This rule provides that with the agreement of both parties, you can release one and continue with another.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks. That was Marilee Peters, our communications manager, by the way, that was fielding the question. So thanks very much, Marilee, and thanks all of you that were listening. Appreciate your time.